Hi, gang. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. This is Nancy.
Hey, Nancy. Thank you. Never know. I have multiple systems that come into this connection, and I can never tell whether the first one I pick is the right one.
I'm hoping I got a new camera because, my camera hadn't been working on my computer, even though it's a brand new computer, and I didn't want to send it back in. So I just bought a little camera to attach to it. So I hope it's going to be able to let you see me.
There you go. Right now, I can't yet, but soon I will be able to.
Okay, hopefully.
Hey, Rachel.
Hey there.
Carmen.
Hello, hello. We're going to give people a few more minutes to get logged in. How's everybody doing this week?
Okay, my flex shaft just stopped and I wanted a little input from you.
Okay.
So I took off my handpiece and put on my belt sander. And then when I took the belt sander off and put the key, the handpiece back on, the key wouldn't rotate. So does that mean that I need to go up and adjust that length again?
So there's a few things. If it's a true Fordham flex shaft, a lot of times the problem is just that you haven't got it fully engaged. So with the Fordhams, you're actually supposed to run it slowly while you put the handpiece on, which connects.
But I can't even get it. I can't get it to run it slowly. It won't. The key won't turn.
The motor is not turning. There's no power coming to it.
No, I can hear the motor, but the key isn't turning.
Got it. So then sometimes what happens is if you didn't tighten it up at the top where it connects to the pendant motor, it can come there. So there's a big bolt at the end of it that you just need a large wrench for. Mine is sort of an off gray color. You open that thing up and make sure that your line inside is fed all the way up into the key slot.
That's great. That's what I was thinking, but I wanted you to confirm it. Thank you.
Second most common, if that's not out of place, is to look at the bushing pieces, the ones that come out. There's two little plastic bolt points where you get the replacement brushes. And that's the most common thing that they tell us is wrong with Fordhams. But they also have incredibly good customer support. They're based out of Bethel, Connecticut. So any help you can get, you just call them up and say, hey, can you help me troubleshoot? Or they may have videos already. A guy named Mike Zagluski does most of their videos, and he's a really nice guy.
Thank you, Rachel. That's great. Okay.
Anybody else have updates? Or new tools or anything? I just got a box in the mail from Potter USA that I haven't yet opened, but I'm looking forward to it. He had a sale last week while he was in Tucson. For those of us that didn't go to Tucson, I'm very excited to see my first Potter dies. Did anybody go to Tucson? You went to Tucson, Wendy?
I did. That's why I missed your last class.
Oh, got it. Nice.
Yeah. I took 3 classes down there, and then I got into the wholesale shows. Oh my gosh. It was so cool.
Nice. Anybody else managed to go and see any of the gem shows there? All right.
Yeah, me too.
You did, Natasha? What did you buy? Anything good?
Oh yeah, I found lots of good stuff. Too much good stuff.
Nice. Yeah, that's the reason I haven't gone, is that I'm afraid I would be giving up my house mortgage for.
Oh yeah. The joke between my friend and I were that we melted all of the corners of our credit cards and then we moved on to the middle. And then we moved on to any other credit cards.
Nice.
Oh, that's great.
Nice. One of my favorite stone cutters doesn't come to the West Coast, and that's the closest he'll be to me. So it's really, really tempting. A guy named Joe Jelks of Horizon Lapidary, who just does.
Oh, we met him.
Yeah, good.
We went and
He's a
saw
great
him
guy.
at La Fuente. He's really nice.
Yep, and he
He
has some
has
of the
fabulous stuff.
he has some of the best cut stones ever. Like he just does a really good job of edging them for setting well. And he does wholesale if you ask him, if you have a wholesale license. And once you get to know him, he's willing to send you lots of stones so that you can pick and send back what you don't want. But you have to, he doesn't have any web presence, so you have to actually introduce yourself at a show.
He's apparently on Instagram, but he hasn't posted anything yet. So
he is on Instagram. He doesn't post very often. But yeah, he's there. It's Horizon Lapidary, I think. Horizon, yeah, I think it's just Horizon Mineral or Horizon Lapidary. Okay, it looks like we're sort of at the number of people that are likely to show up timely. So I want to get a little business out of the way. I'm going to start by a small hype. I have spots available in this coming week, not this weekend, but the following weekends. 3 clasps and maybe more in 3 days class. So I figured I'd give 30 seconds of showing you the kinds of clasps that are covered in that. We'd be doing box clasps, both the good old fashioned basic box clasps. Okay, oops, that is really glary. Hang on a second, let me try dropping my contrast down a little bit. See if that helps a little bit. So box clasps with, fancier tops or not, I do mochame, I do reticulation silver and so on, or embedded box clasps where they're in a component of your hollow form work. Eventually, when you do box clasps, you can learn to do this sort of integrated box clasp. This is what's called the French Box Clasp. That's put into the hollow form of the project. And so that's one thing we're covering, and there's fancier versions for people that have done a lot of them before. We're also doing a slotted toggle clasp, which is integrated into the centerpiece of the project. Of course, I didn't check to see if these had been squished, where it's a little keyhole and it just slots into the device that you've built and comes over to the other side and locks. There's both closed ones and open versions of those that we go over. And then we also do a hinge-based clasp, which can be used in a lot of beadwork and so on. I do them as either square or round hinge. They're supposed to be fairly snug and nice and tight fitting, and you design them so that the little pin can't get lost. But then once you learn how to do that kind of clasp, you can integrate it into harder forms. So this is my most recent collection. And, they can be used. The person that taught me, Joy Raskin, she taught me the first version of this that I ever learned. She buys leather belts and does decorative, really, she puts all of her emphasis on designing the clasp itself to look really elegant, and then makes a leather belt bracelet out of it that's just stunning. So these are 3 of my favorite styles of clasps to play around with. If you're interested in that, you can hop on my website. I'll post the link. That is a full-scale class with hands-on work in your studio. It's not the same kind of schedule we're keeping for this thing. For those of you, anybody who's brand new, please feel free to pipe up. The deal here is that I love hearing you ask questions and interacting. It's sort of a little bit of a black hole at times for me. So I need to know if you're out there. If you're new to us, welcome. The first 3 videos are posted online, and I tend to be about a week behind at the rate I'm going, but I make no promises about having each session available before the next one, because I do have a day job. We are recording this whole thing so that I can do those videos. And let's see, there is also a Facebook group. Let me post a few links as reminders. The Facebook group is kind of slow and casual. It's just giving us a place to chat or to share links. There's some documents that I've made that are useful if you want them. And I also outline what I've got going on and what I'm planning for each chapter of the book. So if you are truly trying to play along at home with every setting that I'm doing, you'll know roughly what I'm working on. And we're sort of getting I'm hoping to get a couple of times where we get 3 settings in a given session. That's the shortened, speedy version. Any questions?
Those look amazing. What you
They're
showed.
fun. They're really fun. If you don't have time for this class, I am probably teaching one through Metalworks in July that's going to have not this same set of clasps and mix it up a little bit. The only thing they have in common is the box clasp, and that has a few other simpler forms as well as one other advanced clasp. I can't remember right now what I committed to teach on that one, but right now it's going to be a 3-day class. We're finalizing it in the next few weeks.
Really cool.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah. Go ahead,
Go ahead.
Eleanor.
Okay, I'm just wondering, I'm on those online classes where you say you can work along and they're open. How do we set that up to where you could see our work?
So that's a great question. Yeah, what most people do is they have their phone or their laptop in a way that they can bring it close to the work. But what I do is I do a cycle of talk, teach, try it, and then touch base. So what I mean by that is I talk a little bit about what we're working on and why. Then I do a demo. Then I send you back to your benches, but I stay on the call so that if you have to, you can pop up and say, hey, Rachel, can you look at this? Can you, what's wrong with the way that I'm doing this? Or how do I troubleshoot such and such? Then we come back and as a group, troubleshoot or show off what you've done or whatever. We do a few cycles of that a day. And so I'm on for the whole day, aside from we take a brief lunch break somewhere in the middle of the class. And it's a 3-day workshop. So it's as close as I could get to doing a live in-person workshop. And I'm still using this multi-camera setup. So I can, if you need me to, and you're having real trouble with something, I can set up a specific demo while you all are working and show something in more detail.
And so are you saying, I'm still kind of, I have to have like an iPad or another phone that I'm tuned into the Zoom station too, the Zoom station
Yep.
also? Okay, on both devices.
Right, whatever you're using right now should be enough. Some people log in with a phone and a laptop or something, so they can keep
Right.
up a good sized screen and then use the phone at their bench to show me things.
Right, okay,
yeah.
I understand.
Yeah. And if it wasn't clear, those are the paid workshops that I do as opposed to
Right.
this, which is not a full-on teaching gig, but and I'm doing it for free because of the love of John's book and sharing that project with the world.
Thank you very much for that.
Sure. Did somebody else have a question?
Yes, Rachel, I did. I so enjoyed taking your first class. But on this one, it looks like you're going to be working on the French Box Clasp, which is something that I really would like to stretch. Are you going to, okay, explain that. Yeah.
So the French Box Clasp variation, it's not specific to being in a hollow form. The variation is in the shape of the tongue and of the clasp point. So what you're doing is you're building a standard box clasp can sometimes get a little wiggle because it's just a slot that it cuts into. The French version has an extra jig and a narrower top so that it uses itself and its position to keep it from flipping back and forth. So it's just a little bit.
I remember you talking something about that. Yeah. Okay. All right.
And that's something I talk through. I don't demo one per se unless people specifically want to see it. It's really just a slightly different filing and cutting. And there are other classes up in my schedule. So if you're interested in the hollow forms or at the end of the year, I'll be doing a bezels less ordinary, which is fancier versions of some of what we're covering in John's class. Feel free to poke around, but I don't want to make this session about that unless there's a specific question, which you can always text me or email me or pop on Facebook or ask when we're at a breather point at the end. So are there any questions about where we're going today before we get started? Okay, I did a little prep this time because I don't want you guys to sit here and watch half the class, watch me sawing and filing things. So let me clear the samples I was just showing out of the way and switch gears to, so I got to switch cameras. I'm going to do a quick review of what we've done to date. So popping over here, reminding you that we have built a plain bezel, a basic bezel. which we did with 22 gauge top and walls. Then we did a heavy gauge version for the oval, where I was using 18 gauge walls and 22 gauge back. We then started into what we're in now, which is the shoulder bezel phase. And we did a two-parter. In this case, I did an oval with a faceted stone. You can do cabs or faceted. And so the two-parter, meaning we made an outer wall first and then an inner wall. And then we did versions of that with square wires as the inner wall rather than a full height of sheet metal. And you can do that with round or square, remember? So I just did a couple variations on that. And then we worked on rectangular, and I did two variations. I only showed one variation because they're built the exact same way, but I did a variation for my own sake to play around with. I like that John describes how you can cut down the corners and make a very different look. Is that showing in screen? There we go. Make a very different look out of it than just having the cornering. So you may want to play around with some of the versions that he describes. And then what was different about this one? I think I just made another oval using the two-parter. Because today we're going to switch from using the two-part method to using what he describes as method 2, which is making our walls before we start shaping them around the bezel. So we're making a step bezel, which you can in fact buy from some manufacturers, but it's limited the number of heights that it comes in pre-made. So you might as well learn how to make your own. So if you're following along in the book, we are, where did we start this? 60, hold on a sec. We are on page 67. And I brought this up last time, but now we're going to actually take action around it. But there's some layout in the book that is a little bit deceptive. When you're looking under method 2, there's a paragraph just before you hit constructing shoulder bezels for triangular stones, which is what we're about to do, that refers to being able to use the same basic approach of framing your square wires and so on. So it says, from here, the assembly is the same as described above, referring to the prior section on method 1. And that is not the case. When you build your walls, you need to, I have not been spotlighting myself. I'm sorry. I forgot that. And also anyone who's new, you're welcome to call out if I've got the wrong camera up or anything along those lines. So this section is implying that as we did last session where we made the rectangle with two pieces that overlaid each other, where we sort of went beyond the other side and then trimmed back, that we could do that with this pre-made wall that we're making. And that is not entirely the case. Over in the images to the right of that, he describes in the text that you're going to have to actually build your 45-degree angles into your walls. So the images are more accurate than the confusion that can be caused by it's the same as the prior assembly. Just make notes about that to yourself. That'll hopefully make more sense as we go. One of the things that I'm going to be talking about as I go through my discoveries on this, I find that there are certain shapes of stones that are easier to be done with the method 1 and certain stones that are easier to do with method 2. Specifically, I believe teardrops are a little bit, pear shaped. We're working on teardrops down the road. Pear shapes are a little bit easier with the method 2. And I want to practice a little bit more, but I think the marquees are probably a little easier that way. I think personally that square and rectangular stones are easier as two-parters than they are in one, because getting those angles, the lengths of the walls so precise is a challenge. And he talks about that earlier in the book, about how the biggest mistake is about not accounting for enough fold measurement. So with that in mind, the first thing that I'm going to be doing today is making one of those two-parters into a single sheet length of step. And I pre-measured and pre-cut this for the stone that I will be setting first. I just don't have a lot of triangular shaped stones, so I'm sort of having to work with what I've got. I've got a very unevenly sized rutile. Is it rutile? I never remember whether the dark is the rutile or the tourmalinated quartz. And
Rutile.
it's rutile. Okay, thank you. So this has a lot of oddities to it because it is nowhere near a well-shaped triangle, but we're going to set that one anyhow, just because it's big enough for me to work in. So I measured looking for the height of the stone in total from table to coulet, and gave myself a little extra height beyond it so that I would have something for it to stand up on. If I'm working with this big a stone, I want a big setting. And then I determined how much would keep the bottom of the stone. Let's see if I can do this on the other side. Would keep the bottom of the stone from hanging off the bottom while still giving me enough to set. So let me see if that's showing. So you can see the blackened side is the bottom, the inside wall, and the silver side is the outside wall. And I'm going to put these together now. I have already pre-sanded and filed them so that they are nice and clean. And we're going to hop on over and set this up at the bench. This is where T-pins come in really handy. If you don't have steel T-pins, you can make, John used to refer them as croquet hoops, what's the name of the croquet use that you put in to the ground? Croquet devices. So you can make little croquettes. I like that idea. You can make them out of, pardon?
Wickets.
Wickets, thank you, perfect, wickets. So you can make little wickets out of heavy gauge binding wire and do similar things, but I wouldn't go this light. You want something that's going to be a little bit of a stiff stopper for the piece. And so what I've done is I've cut my outer wall ever so slightly shorter than my inner wall, and I mean like barely, and that's probably not even enough. I'm going to trim a little bit more off of it. What I need is enough room between them to give myself room for a pin on each end, because I want these flush along the bottom and I want them to stay in place top to bottom as well. So for this setup, what I like to do is create a little row as the back wall. You can just see I'm setting up a straight edge where there's something for the bottom plate to bump up against firmly.
So I have a question about the
Sure.
measurement.
Yep.
So you went with the measurement method 1, which is bezel setting. Is that the measurement you went through to get that outcome?
So this is all a step or shoulder bezel. So let me draw for a second. I'm sorry. I had assumed that the wall framing was something I didn't need to show you, but that is a bad assumption on my part. So let me draw this.
I understand it, but like I know that on page 37 it talks about the bezel, and then it talks about the, you know, the round and the oval, but then I didn't know what to do for square.
Oh, for the, you're talking about for the, how did I get the length?
Right. What method are you using?
I'm using the ballpark it method, making sure that I know the total outer diameter of the stone I'm setting. In the case of a triangle, you can measure all sides, add them together, and then give yourself a few millimeters extra for it, because you're going to need, and I would say probably 5 to 6 millimeters at least, because you need the extra for the folds that you're going to be doing, and there will be some filing. In all honesty, I often just make extra. I have scrap. I know I'm going to have scrap. If I were working in gold and being more careful about not having wastage, I would be more precise with that. But I realize I should probably draw what we're building. So before we built 2 separate pieces. We built the outer wall, and then we built an inner wall and soldered that into place. Remember that little angle space?
Yes.
Where we let the solder flow. In this case, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be attaching those 2 in advance. and then shaping things. So previously we've been building an outer frame and then building the inner frame that's snugged into it. There's pros and cons to each method. The building of the frame first means that your time is spent perfectly fitting the inner wall to the outer wall. Whereas you're going to discover the time that we spend on this one is once we put it, soldered it together, and we start to shape this, getting the angles exactly where we want is what's going to take the time consuming, wow, my words are not doing what they should today. It is going to be the time consuming part is getting the exact angles and shaping that we want. Now, one thing that John does not say in the book that I'm a little curious why he wouldn't say it, and maybe it's just that he doesn't use his own method too as often, is in this approach, he does not tell us to take a piece and file it down off the back corner to allow for solder flow room, which I find a little curious. I mean, I would do it if you're using it, especially if you're using anything heavy gauge back as your inner wall. Give yourself that little extra spot so that when it flows, again, we end up flat instead of having a little solder bump, creating an impact to that corner because you're going to end up filing.
What point would you do that before you even
before we tack it down? Yeah, before we tack it down. Okay, so back to any other questions on that before I keep going? All right, tacking down. So I'm first setting up a nice straight edge that both pieces, ideally my factory cut edge or shear cut edge, because my sawing skills are not good enough to keep me that straight, are going to bump up against. So my big outer wall, and then on top of that is going to be the inner wall, which is a little bit longer. Man, I still didn't give myself enough room. Let me take a little more off because I want enough room to lock the lower piece in place. So you can see there's a tiny bit of overage that's up, the inside piece comes over. What I'm doing is I'm locking into the corner so that it doesn't move on me on both ends, because then I know that one side isn't lifting and scooting up the wall. I've got a good sort of blockade to keep it in position all the way along and keep it nice and even, because the most critical part of this, besides cutting your strips nice and consistently, is then soldering them consistently so that you have an even flow. And I'm going to toss one or two for good measure so it doesn't slip forward. More of these on the big layer there. Okay, and this is going to take a quick hot heat because it's a lot of metal to cover. And if you right now I'm using 22 gauge outer and 24 gauge inner. If you do anything heavier, it takes even longer. So have patience with yourself, but be aware that if you're on it for a long time, you're upping your fire stain and fire scale risk. I'm using both my Prips flux and my paste flux for this one. And I need to cut some fairly consequential amounts of hard solder for this. John tells us he wants us using hard solder for putting it together, as well as for when we solder it together into the bezel shape, if possible. And then he moves to easy for attaching them to things. I'm not a fan of that because it gives coloration issues around, he uses pieces of solder so small that you can't see them if you're a couple feet away from him. So maybe he doesn't get quite the amount of spillage that I do, but I try to avoid using easy solder if possible. It's not always possible. I think probably he's also doing that because people who do repairs are going to be much happier if the only thing that comes apart when they start to resize or adjust something is the seam that attaches it, because then it's not going to all fall apart and they're only going to have to reconnect the bezel. Okay, I am, for those of you that are new, I'm using a Smith Air acetylene torch. I happen to be using a #1 tip as my go-to. I'm doing a fairly hot torch in this case. preheating, and I always have my big pliers, my big tweezers in hand to try and encourage the metal downward if it starts to arc as it warms up, because it may not be properly fully annealed. And I can also use that as a time to check to make sure that nothing is trying to sneak out of place as it wants to do. Then I'm going to position solder all along that upper seam line, trying not to tuck it in. It's really springy. I'm going to start with the place that doesn't want to spring up. And it never hurts to go back and add more later. I'm going to be trying to draw this solder through from the upper edge down through the back to the bottom, what will become the bottom of my step bezel. Okay, I'm heating again. I have my handy dandy pliers, tweezers. It was a very long day at the day job today, I can tell. Too many Zoom meetings. And again, I'm just making sure that as I touch down, I'm making sure that I don't have any spots that are trying to spring out of place. It's up there. As soon as I start to see it flowing, I'm really pushing down, not holding my tweezers onto the piece. I'm just trying to use it as a touchdown. If you leave them there too long, the steel is going to cause you grief when you're soldering. And what I'm ideally looking for is that little, I call it the sunrise effect, when solder finally flows down the back seam here. If I need to, I can come to the front to get a little heat going if they're not wanting to flow. Always love that sunrise shine when the sun runs across the seam. You can see this is getting pretty hot. You could put this up on, a steel mesh or something like that, but you run the risk of really warping the piece from the differential of where the steel heats up and moves at a different expansion than the silver itself. So I'm not a huge fan of lifting pieces up if you don't have to. There are some pieces that are so big and unwieldy that the only way to get the heat below them is to do a lift, but that makes it harder to keep them in line. So if I were going to do that, I'd try to sort of tack solder it down and then position it on the grid or whatever for the final push down. And another favorite of mine to rest things on is nickels, because it's really, really hard to solder things to nickel without realizing it. You're going at a very different temperature when you do. There we go, starting to go. Come on, flow with me. Remember, solder follows the heat. So if it's not flowing all the way down, your heat isn't in the right spot, or you don't have enough solder in that spot. Could be both in this case. Okay, so I've got a nice line along the top edge. I want to just give it a little bit more along the back to make sure that it's flowed out. I'm thinking like squishing a peanut butter sandwich so that the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, so the jelly comes out. And if I don't have a great area on a certain stretch of it, I'm going to put a dab of solder right where the two pieces meet so that I can try and get a little bit better flow. Because as we flow solder, some of the, what are they called, volatiles, the things that are not silver, are starting to melt off. So for example, hard solder, you can get to reflow only so many times, but by the time you get down to easy solder, you have a few more opportunities to get it to flow because it's a less silver, more of the components that the solder that cause the solder to be melting at a lower temperature. So you can sometimes get your solder to reflow just by adding a little bit more of a solder, or don't tell anybody, but you can sometimes get it to flow a little better by adding a little bit of the next level down to your solder spot. And like a medium solder will start to flow, and by the time it's flowed, the heat gets up to temperature for getting your, whatever your harder solder was, down. So again, I'm just doing a little touch up to make sure that I've got a truly good connection, because this is the edge that I'm going to file cleanly at the end, and which should look like there's been no gapping at all, that it's really just one piece once I've filed it cleanly. I think that does the trick. So you can see that takes a little bit of time, but it gives us the advantage of being able to make custom heights that we want and custom thicknesses. You know, a lot of step bezel, pre-manufactured step bezel material is fairly thin. So if you want a heavier weight bezel, you're going to want to make it yourself. Note that I'm quenching and then moving them out of my bowl. I have a quench bowl that if you're like me and you don't change the water often enough, and there's even a hint of pickle in there, if you leave your little steel bits in your water bowl, you might find that your stuff is copper coated. Now that that's cooled a bit, I'm going to quench it. So we now have a very, very small lip for the edge of my stone for setting. And I've got a good long strip of it to work with. I'm going to toss that in the pickle and see if y'all have any questions. Anyone?
That seems like
What-
a really thick bezel.
Say again?
How many millimeters is it? It seems like it's going to be very tall.
It is going to be a top. So my stone is fairly high and awkward. So I'm giving myself a little bit more height so that I have some room to work with. I might turn this into something decorative where I take away pieces of it, in which case I want to have enough excess that I can play with detailing at the bottom. But it's a fairly hefty stone.
Yeah.
So I think on this one, what did I do? I think it was 11 millimeters or something.
Okay. And when
Other
you were
questions?
soldering,
Yep.
excuse me, but when you were soldering, you just did the solder on the very top, not on the bottom or anything.
So at the end, what I was doing was touching up where I can either flood the top and it should come down through the bottom, or I can be judicious and then do careful touch up. So the last thing I was doing was putting little pieces of solder where I didn't see enough of a fill along the what will become the bottom. Partially because I want to make sure that I don't have a big lump of solder along the top. I'm going to have to do a little bit of cleanup if I get lumps. But remember, we don't want a slope. We want sort of a crisp or angled, intentionally angled line. Let's see. So, Carmen, you're adding the length and the width, divide by 2. So it depends on so you're doing more precise measurement if you're doing the method 1, Carmen, is what you're asking about. For a rectangular stone, you're doing length plus width. I'm going to bring up my formula because as soon as we hit the math, I'm going to get confused. Hang on. So for a rectangle, it is 2 times the length plus the width plus the thickness of the material you're using. That's for a rectangle, but that will not work as well for this method we're going to do today. That's for I'm building an outer and an inner wall separately. Nancy, you asked, we need to taper the inner bezel before we solder it down. So we get to the tapered bezels later on. You could make tapered bezels out of these, but then you run into problems like you need to make sure you have enough inner wall thickness to give yourself a position to sit it on. this series of bezels that we're on right now, John does not talk about them in terms of tapering. At the very end of this chapter, or maybe it's the next chapter, it might be with the crown settings, he shows us tapered. So I'll pull out one of my bezel blocks and show how those are done.
Oops, I didn't mean that. What I
Okay.
meant was, you know how in the last one, we tapered that inner bezel a little bit, the top of it.
The angle, yeah. So if you're
Yes,
gonna do that,
yes,
yeah, so that's what I meant.
I'm sorry, I should have been a little clearer.
That's okay. That's okay. So John does not explicitly say that in this book, on this section, on this
Yes.
version, which was a surprise to me. But it won't hurt, and it might make your bezel cleaner if you do. So let me switch back to that drawing board again. Taking your pieces separately, when you're making your outer and your inner pieces, if you pick what is your inside upper wall and you file this little bit off, you'll get a cleaner lip where it connects, because then once we connect, we'll have this, right? Instead of this.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
would you please repeat that formula that you just told Carmen about? I didn't get it down quite fast enough.
So on a rectangular stone, one of the formulas that works is you add the length plus the width plus the thickness of the material you're working with, and then multiply that whole thing by 2. Now, again, these are all ballparks. They're to give you enough plus filing room and so on. And your own mileage may vary depending on how straight you cut. I need to give myself lots of extra because my filing is kind of squicky.
Me too. Me too. Me too.
Right. Any other
Rachel?
questions? Yep.
Are there any advantages or disadvantages of trying to sweat solder that strip?
So for me, I personally abhor sweat soldering, except in the most dire of circumstances, because then I'm putting full on heat on my piece more times than if I can just. But if the only way for you to get it well positioned, the answer is whatever works for you is the right answer. I personally try to avoid tacking anything. I try to do as much first time as my only time through, because it means less chance of overheating the whole thing and getting, if I have twice the chance of overheating and giving myself scale and stain. But your mileage may vary. Find what works for you. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yep.
So how do you know how much to leave on the top open for the stone?
Good question. And the answer is it's going to depend on whether we're working with a cab or a faceted stone. You express things differently for one than for the other, or you rather interpret things differently. So let's think about how the mechanism of how a bezel is held in, right? And we've got our little basic, nicely made, either method 1 or method 2, the same truth applies. One of our stones, the cab, is going to sit on it and stick out, right? Oops, that's a bad proportion. There we go. Stick on it and stick out, right? So it's resting on it. Whereas the other, if we were doing a faceted stone, would do this and have something that sets down below, right? So for the cab version of it, we don't, pardon? I froze?
Yeah.
You froze.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me see. You got the drawing of the cab version sitting in this setting, and you've got the drawing of the faceted stone sitting in this setting, right? And I should do it right and give you guys the pieces. Is that showing to you guys?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm going to live in fear of freezing. I haven't frozen on any of my 8-hour-long days of classes, but this gig apparently it complains every once in a while. So with our cab, there's nothing living down here, right? There's no below that lip that we've built for the shoulder. So we could get away with very little. We could chop this off like this, right? doesn't have to have all that extra unless we want it for stylistic reasons. However, when we're working on our faceted version, the important thing is that this, the culette of the stone, never actually bump into anything, not the finger, not the metal below it, because that'll create chip opportunities, right? Or somebody bangs it against something and it pushes down against the metal because of the hit, the force of the hit, it'll chip off the end or cause a fracture along one of the spots that's hitting it. So for that, we need a longer piece and we need a little bit of excess there to give us that squeak room so it doesn't bang up against anything. Making sense?
Yeah.
So when you ask me how much, how do I know how much? I'm looking at different things on the, I'm going to take away my lovely little faceted stone for a second. On this one, I'm looking at the curvature of the stone to see where will it hit. And this is where we go back to what John said about if you're using a fairly lightweight bezel, go towards a third of the way up the stone-ish. But if you're using a heavier gauge bezel, you can get away with a quarter. That's a general rule. That's not a perfect rule for every stone you ever have, because some stones are, and this is where the cut of the stone comes in, and where that chapter 1 and chapter 2, I can't remember which portion it was, where he discusses picking your stones. You got to start looking at stones when you're shopping a little differently, because if you get a stone that is like this and its walls are very straight, you need to get high enough up in order to hold it in place, right? So the stone can impact that, and we'll see it a few bezels from now when we start playing around with the conical shape, which is the epitome of a pain in the butt for getting, where do I set it? Because then you've got this, right? So can we get away with just a little bit? It depends on what kind of, how strong is our metal? Are we using a heavy gauge or what have you? But the general rule of thumb with a well-cut stone is going to be in that 1/3 to 1/4 for a cabochon. Let me put this back to the faceted version. And the faceted version gives us a couple of other challenges, because faceted stones have even more variation in their cuts. I'm going to make a really, really thick stone setting here so you guys can see it. So our faceted stones, we actually want resting. So we're going to probably end up trimming down, filing down a little bit so that it's not the point poking in. So we want it resting in that spot, basically. So we need less material up here. We're going to trim it back to be just enough to get over this. And a good rule of thumb that I was taught is if you look at the crown of let's take a traditional round stone, there's usually a couple of layers of the facets, like a basic stone. This is a really terrible drawing of a facet, but the setting doesn't need to come up beyond, if there's a second row of the faceting, it only needs to go as far as the first bend in the facets. That's really obvious when you get to like square and or emerald cut in particular. Let me do an emerald cut, since that's our next crazy project, next session or the session after. So there's a little facet in an emerald cut like that, and then there's usually either a smooth or a series of small facets along this way. Your setting should never come all the way up that first corner facet. It should only come just far enough to go over the edge of that. If anybody has learned has other opinions on that, or has learned other good guides for that, please pipe up. But then when I'm measuring for the inner wall, as we are today, what I'm looking at is what will get me from here to here, right? Plus enough to have a little
Rachel,
bit
could
of,
you move it over your board
right
over
in
a
the
bit?
shiny,
There
yep.
you go. Thank
Sorry,
you.
let me redraw that piece. So what I'm looking for is for the inner wall height you asked about, that's what started me off on this wander here. What I need is to go from where it's going to rest down, plus a little bit of wiggle room so that filing and stuff like that, but also so that there's no risk whatsoever of that hitting somebody's hand, somebody's finger, or the metal beneath it. You can always go taller than that. You could set this up on a pedestal and have a really giant something supporting your stone, and that becomes part of your design. Just think about whether that's a wise thing. You know, in a pendant, it might tip over if it's weight heavy at the stone, and in a ring, it might bang into things. So choose your design need wisely. Questions? Okay, I'm going to see if my stuff is out of the pickle. Nope, there was a question. Yes.
Yeah, so where the girdle is,
Yep.
that's where it's like even, and then it tapers up on the table.
Yep.
So then it should hit where the girdle is, and then a little bit more.
The outer wall is what's going to be the above the girdle.
Right.
The inner wall is from the girdle is going to basically be resting on that wall downward, and you need a little bit more than what's left. Think of it as an iceberg. The stuff that we're using the outer wall for is showing above the water. The stuff that we're using the below the wall is everything on the bottom of the iceberg that we can't see. So we need iceberg plus room for the iceberg to float.
Yeah, I get what you're saying with the actual cutlet on the bottom. I
Yep.
get that because I ran across it and I basically soldered another piece of metal to make it longer.
Oh, okay, that's a good cheat. That's a nice way of doing it.
But I didn't finish it because I wanted to ask you the question because I didn't know how high the top part, you know, the inner wall height on the top should be.
The inner wall height on the top. So the top should only be represented by the outer wall. So I'm a little confused.
Well, when I look at the book on page 11, it shows the girdle, right?
Page 11. Let me catch up to you on the pages. Hang on. Page 11. Yep.
It has the girdle.
Yep.
And that's where when you have the wall that you just soldered, that's
Yep.
where it stops.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So then how much higher do you go up from there?
Right. So that none of the inner wall is going higher than that. It's only the outer wall that goes higher than that, because that's what we're going to fold down. And that's where this is actually a great drawing for what I drew very badly a minute ago. You see how there's a lower set of facets right touching the crown, and then there's the big kite shaped ones. So the little triangles running along the base of the crown, you don't want to go higher than any of those. You just need to go enough over it to hold the stone in, which the thicker your bezel wall, the less high you need to go. But you also, even on your thinnest bezel, you don't want to go above that point, because then you're going to be hitting the edges of where the facets are cut, and it'll start to, one, it'll invade the beauty of the stone, but two, it risks chipping at the corners of each cut. Because anytime a facet meets another facet, it's a risk point for damage. Is that making more sense? The other thing is you can always file down. You can always file down. So give yourself extra and trim back.
Yeah. Because right now mine is like a millimeter.
Which, depending on the size of your stone, could be just enough or could be too much.
Right. I think it's too much.
Okay. Well, that's easy to fix. It's easier to fix than if you made it too short. That's the good thing.
Okay. Thank you. I was just
Sure.
a little confused.
Okay. So let me show you what I've got back out of the pickle. I have a little bit of excess solder that flowed on, so I'm going to probably want to do that cleanup now. In this case, the rule of thumb is John's rule is don't file until you have to. when it's going to be harder to get to the spot than it was. Let me move this back to my bench pin a little bit more. Sorry for the wobblies. If it's going to be harder to get to this after we do something to it, then we need to sand and file it now. So I'm doing just a little bit of quick touch up to get off some of my excess solder. And I'm going to potentially, because the place that I have the most solder happening accidentally is where I put it down on the top lip, I'm going to run a small square file or a nicely polished barrette file is even better. A barrette file is just going to take material off the outer wall, just cleaning it up a little bit. So just a little bit here, or I could use a square file as long as I'm aware that I have to make sure I don't cut too deeply into my my lower wall. So again, just trying to clean up a little bit of the excess solder that was left behind in a couple spots. In a perfect world, you'll be so good at soldering this that you won't have that. I have yet to reach that state of nirvana. And I can see that I had a little slippage on this side, which is one of the reasons that I have made myself a longer piece than I needed, because I can choose an end to work from.
As you're working, Rachel, would you go over again how you polish your highly polished barrette file?
The broad, so this is straight from Charles Luton Brain, and you might be able to find a video of him describing it or doing it even on Gnoxen or something. You grind down on a grinder, or with, he uses a large wheel grinder of some kind. Or you can use, if you're really, really careful and don't overheat it, you can use like a Mizzy heatless, and you gradually taper down, not getting rid of too much thickness in the middle, but just the end. So you're tapering it down to a smooth point and leaving it very, very thin. The better quality file you have, the more thin you can make it without breaking it. And then once you've got that done, you sand it a bit and then do a high polish on it with some cutting compound like a Tripoli or something. And clean it up, rinse it off in warm soapy water to get all the gunk off of it, and then dry it very carefully so it doesn't rust after all that effort. You may have to dip it in water occasionally while you're grinding it in order to get, so that you're not overheating, because if you overheat, if the steel starts to change colors on you as you're grinding, then you're changing its temper, and you don't want to do that. So occasional dips in water will restrict that will keep that from happening.
So glad I asked. Thank you.
Yeah. I recommend just buy yourself a backup set of barrette files, or as you're getting rid of old barrette files, play with them, convert them, so that you're not breaking your brand new, super fancy, expensive files. That exercise is, again, a Charles Luton Brain version of this. That's different than what John's describing, where he sands down the edges, which is a good thing to do on any of your barrette files. And that's just running it on progressively finer and finer sandpaper until it's got a nice smooth lip. Okay, I don't think I'm going to do much more on that. If you wanted to, this would be a good point to actually flatten and clean up your back edge, other than taking these couple of little solder blobs that I didn't get to flow off the end. I'm not going to do much to that because I can also do it after I make my bezel. It's another reason to give myself a little bit of over height. And I'm trimming off this very end piece because definitely got a little out of alignment there. Okay, so onward to the challenges that this method 2 presents. When we were talking about building method 1 style, we would be building one entire outer frame, solder it all in place, make sure it's a nice snug fit on the outside, and then build the frame that goes inside of that well-fitting exterior. When we're doing it from pre-made work, we have to work one upside down so that we know that we are resting, we're sizing according to where where the stone is going to rest. So it's really hard to work this way and size it. We have to put it on its table and figure out where we're going and pick a side and create the first of our bends. Okay, so I'm going to be making a V first and going from there. Here's where we get to the stuff that makes me think maybe John doesn't like this particular approach to making things very much, because he didn't go into a lot of detail beyond the do it the way you would have in the earlier section. So in a triangle setting, he's got drawings that show us on page 69 that you do this as two, that you do this as a V plus a third part. If you're using method 2, that doesn't cut it, because it's really, really hard to get the fit of a pre-made bezel to step together. And this one I'm going to try to draw, but it's one that doesn't really click until you see it in action. So when we make the outer walls versus the inner walls, we build a triangle, and he's got a model where we're building it this way. We've made this little V here. So we've got one wall, and then we've got a second wall that we build separately. It flushes up nicely. And then we build our inner wall independent of that in the same manner, and it fits smoothly inside. Okay, so that's our wall 2. That's pretty straightforward. You make 2 triangles and they nest. When we have a wall that has a little shelf on it, and we go to hit an angle, this is not showing my shelf very well. So this is our inner wall that's already attached, right? As soon as we bump that up against another wall, let me do that in a different color and it'll maybe make more sense. As soon as we bump it up against another wall that has something coming off of it. So this is wall 2. As soon as we get there, when we butt them right up against the way we would have done over here, we have a gap here that is the size of the depth of our wall, right? Because these two, the 2 lower inner walls, hit each other nicely, but that leaves these distanced apart by the wall that's in between them. So our choices are to get these angled in such a way that they perfectly fit here and here. These both have to be angled so that they fit neatly. And this one will be angled. Let me see if I can get this right for the drawing. This one will be angled like that. So they have to fit perfectly. And it's a royal pain in the butt to get this line. We can do it by a series of filings and then sawing down until we get to the exact angle that we want. But it gets harder and harder the more angles you put in. The other thing we can do is, instead of making it in pieces, and that's what John is, this other option is what John is showing on page 68. We can make it as a strip that, just like on making our squares before, we're actually filing.
Bring it down a little bit,
Oh,
Rachel.
thank you. Yep, we're actually filing. Let me redraw that because you can't see the action. So we've got our one long strip, and we have our lower wall coming off of it, right? So we've got the little bench that we've made. So in this technique, it's easier to keep it in place and mark out and file in for each of the bends. Because then on this triangle, what we get is, too many drawings here, let me see. On the triangle, what we get is a bend that we've put in here and a bend that we've put in here. And then
Frozen.
am I back?
Nope, frozen.
And
Still
it's just
frozen.
the
Let me switch
video.
channels. Is my face back?
Nope.
No.
But you can hear me, huh?
Yep.
Yep.
That's even weirder than the last time when everything was frozen. Let me give it a sec and see if it kicks off again.
Oh,
or
there we go.
back. Okay,
Yep.
so you can see the board,
Yep.
the drawing board. Okay, good. All right, so let me go back to the what is a triangle. So if we have our triangular stone and we're using the this method that we're building already, we're going to start out by making a wall that we just put a bend in. So it's a partial cut through and V. And we're going to do the same thing like that, right? So this is all one piece, starting here and going that way, taking a bend, taking another bend, and continuing on. And then all we're doing is fitting this to the corner. So then we have one spot that we have to saw the angle on. If we build it the same way we did when we made the walls separately, where we're building a V and then another wall, we have two spots we have to get perfectly lined up. So with the two-parter, what I'm discovering is that it's not worth the battle to try and fight filing every angle separately. You're going to want to limit the number of angles you're putting into it. This is why I'm sort of saying that certain stones are easier with one method than with the other, because let's look ahead for a minute to another stone that we're going to do, which is the pear. So this is our stone. We got a nice little faceted stone here. On this one, it's a single activity of,
Rachel,
yep,
you're almost, oh, that's better.
it's a single activity of, we're going to have a wall that we're building around it. And what we have to do is cut down that center line. So on a pear, it may be easier, faster, smoother to have your wall pre-built than to try to force an outer wall and an inner wall together at the perfect point. Again, this is one of those, your mileage may vary. I'm going to recommend that, like me, you try multiple variations on it. When I'm not on screen, I'm testing all the different combos that I can think of to see what works for me. And marquee, I suspect, will be the same way, because again, we're putting only a single V cut, not a cut, but a V bend in. And then all of our tricky part is in cutting down that final line when we've got the outer wall. Oops, right in the spotlight. Hang on. See if I can get this a little bit less spotlighty. So think ahead as you're building these walls to what stones they do and don't work for you on. And on this triangle wall, we're going to build it without making separate pieces. We're going to try to build with the bends only. And then the final trick of getting that last cut is going to be the only tricky part. So one of the things he mentioned somewhere else in the book, I'm not sure which chapter, is to make sure that if you're doing cornering, you mark your starting corner on your stone, unless it's something porous like opal or something, in which case put a little notch of tape or something, so that you always know, because the stone is not going to be exactly cut all the way around, you always know where you're starting. So what I'm doing in this case, let me put it up on something we'll actually show to you guys. Unfortunately, I don't have a good color of stone for this one, is I'm starting with a little bit of excess. My stone is upside down. I'm starting with a little bit of excess hanging off the front edge. And I've got the single lip, the thinner of the wall, down, because what I want is for this stone to be resting on that wall when I flip it right side up. So if you think about how a stone rests, I need it to just be sitting on that wall. So sizing from that, I'm marking the position, so moving that stone. Again, leaving myself a little extra at the front. I'm marking where I want to make my fold, not my cut, but my fold. I'm going to square this. I'm going to score it with a marking tool of some kind. I'm going to take my saw and start as if I were cutting, but not cutting through. What I'm looking for is to follow the score line. And that's why I do it flat on-ish instead of upright like I would if I were sawing through a piece. I just want to deepen my score line without cutting through. And I want to go, basically, I know that if I haven't made a mark on the outer wall, then I'm not worrying about cutting through. So I want to go until I just start to brush the outer wall at the top of the shoulder. Once I've got that, I'm going with my triangle file. And this is the one that I need to always remind myself that slow is better in this case. I invariably go off the little track I've made if I go too fast. I'm taking very slow, purposeful strokes. And periodically, I'm going to flip it because we have a tendency to file downward towards the front, which means one edge will be gouged in more than the other. And I want to go to about the 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the thicker wall where the double wall is. Again, flipping periodically. Watching for how much I'm going through. I'm still only about halfway through, so I've got a good ways yet to go. I think I need to get a fresh triangle file. This one's starting to wear. Now, you can touch up with the square file. It's not going to do much good when you're on a triangle shape that you're building because you're going beyond the 90-degree mark in most cases. But it's a good habit to get into is to start with your triangle and use the square to finish off. Because when we're doing rectangles and squares, that's a nice crisp corner. In this case, we're going to do it as a series of saw and file exercises. Oops, not those pliers, these. So once again, remember that when you're using your parallel jaw pliers, you want to line them up just to the edge of your fold line, and you're not using them to bend, you are bending against them. Okay, so they become the squaring up activity. And I always like to check from both sides, make sure that I've got everything flush. But this, of course, only gives me a square, and my corner needs to be more than square. Oops, of course, I mark my piece and then I use the wrong side. So give me a second. Remark my stone point. Starting edge. So obviously I'm way off of the size I need, and I could force it, but that's going to start to curve and bend this. So the next thing I do is I take my saw and super carefully I'm gonna just saw down the seam that I made, the crevice that I've now folded in. So what my goal is with this is to take away the material that's keeping it from bending further, but not cut all the way through. So I'm going to do a series of progressively more vehement angling in. So sawing and then angling, sawing and then angling. And again, try to work alternating sides. So this is just using the saw as a file. This is the concept that we're going for here. Think of it as light touch, slightly more risky file rather than as a saw. The goal is not to get through. The goal is to move metal out of the way. That gets me. And I don't want to be distorting the angle of either of my walls. I want to keep them as upright as I can for all of this. When you see that one edge or the other is getting more of a curved shape than a bent shape, it probably means you're not being good about equal side emphasis. You know, you're not sawing and filing consistently from both sides.
When you're bending that, can you come up a little bit higher up so we can see what you're doing with the pliers?
Oh, sure. Yeah, with the pliers. Yeah, let me
That's
just
okay. I just couldn't see it.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
So again, I'm just clearing a little bit of the metal away, saw acting as a file. Very carefully going across instead of my normal cutting of up down, because it's really, really hard to control how far through you go unless you're watching yourself work. Okay, so I've got some material out of the way. Is that close enough to see?
Yes, that's great. That's great.
I'm using this only as a device for holding, and then I'm pushing. When I'm in a square corner, I can actually push directly up against this. As soon as I hit a triangular angle, I'm going to need to do sort of keep it slightly out of the way and push against the force of the hold rather than the actual corner edge, because I bump into the edge. That was a very bad explanation for this gets in the way. Okay, so let's see how our angle is doing. Going back to, where is my starting spot? Okay, still not a steep enough angle. I've got a ways yet to go, and I don't have room yet. Yeah, it does. If you're pushing too hard and it starts to curve your metal, pause, take a little more material away. So it feels like you should eventually have sawed your way through, but in truth, what we're filing out of the way with the saw is the material from the two side walls that are compressing together. So we're really just sawing back down to the original seam that with the crease that we made. We're just clearing material out of the way to get there. So this is a slow and steady wins the race activity. And the earlier in the process that you can correct any warping that you see in your walls, the better. So I see I'm getting a little bit of a force warp in there, so I'm pushing too hard.
You're out of camera, Rachel.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm also nearsighted, so my default is to bring things close to my face. Let's see how we're doing. And once you start getting a triangle shape, you can look at it from above. It's just that you don't want to do your actual fitting from above. So I can start to see I'm getting very, very close. I've got a few degrees that I need to push this further. Back to the saw. This is why round and oval stones are a better place to start when you're first doing this kind of setting, because holy crap, can these make you frustrated having to go back and forth over and over again. Trying to keep this still in view and not block you guys, but it's hard to do. Hold it that way. It's really not going to show for you. Starting spot. There's our starting spot. Oh, that's looking nice. Okay. So I now have a fairly good angle following the cornering of my stone on that one corner. I could maybe push it in a hair more, I think, which I may be able to do with this, or I may need one more pass. No, I'm gonna need one more pass. Just a light touch up. So, I can put the wrong angle in. Okay, I've overshot and I've made it too tight. That's an easy fix because I can just open the angle back out a little bit. And I want to be in good shape for that because it makes the next bend much easier to do. Now, two approaches you can take here. One is you can do your solder to that corner now that you've got it in place, and that gives you more stability. The downside is it gets in your way for when you're trying to angle and position your next corner. I prefer to solder it because I know that otherwise I may mismeasure, I may distort my angle. So I'm going to pop over to the block using a little bit of hard solder and working from what will become the bottom of the bezel. I am going to solder from the top down, for the bottom up rather. So this is the 2-part layer, and this on the bottom is the 1-part layer. Let's see, I see on the pear shape, wouldn't it be easier to file in the point and solder in the back? I don't understand that question entirely, Nancy. File in the point?
Okay, you know, like, okay, your pear has the point and then the round back. Would it be easier to make like the triangle that you're making now and leave enough room and come around and solder it in the back? I just wondered, I mean, it's just an idea that
no, it is. It's an interesting idea. It might be
a lot easier than trying to come together at that point, I would think. I've never done one, so see, I can't really say.
I want to say John makes some commentary in his section on pear-shaped stones about why he does it in the front. Okay. Which is a few pages ahead of where we are now. I think it's like 72 or something, 70.
Okay, I'll check that out and see what it is. I just thought that was interesting.
But I mean, again, if it works, I think part of the reason is that it may be around that he expects to set it by pushing the point down. You're already going to have to file down the point. So why give yourself another spot that's going to be hard by the solder?
Yes, that's true. That's true. That's true.
What size front blade am I using on this? I think I'm using a 2 because I'm going through. This is one of the challenges when you have multiple weights of things is do you work towards the heavier material or do you work towards the finer material? Err on the side of a finer tooth. And all that will happen to you is that you'll have to saw a little longer. If you err on the side of too coarse of a tooth for what you're going through, you might find that the sawing catches when you hit thinner metal. The base rule of thumb, if you don't know what size blade to use, is 2 to 2.5 teeth for the thickness of the metal. That general, like you can bump up, you can hold your sheet metal. I'm just waving at you like you can see me, my hands. You can hold your sheet metal up and then you want to see if it has 2 to 2.5 teeth hitting the width of the metal at any given saw point. If it gets finer than that, it'll just take longer. If it gets coarser than that, it starts to catch on the downstroke. Back to the bench. Okay, so we are once again using hard solder. I'm soldering just that corner I made. I'm just doing a little fill solder to strengthen it back up from all the sawing and filing that we just did. And again, I'm soldering from the bottom, what will become the bottom of this bezel downward. I'm again using hard solder. Don't need quite the flame that I had for putting the two pieces together. Just putting it into the top of the crease and trying to run it down the crease to the bottom, or to what will be the top. This is the kind of stretch that if you are having a hard time doing everything with hard solder, you could get away with doing medium at this point. Just make sure you've gotten your flow all the way into the upper crease. If you haven't, flip it over and grab a little bit more and touch it up. It's just easier and cleaner if you can do this mostly from the bottom so that it doesn't create a solder blob in your crease. Right, there we go. Took long enough. Second to cool. Punch it. Got a nice firm angle there, so that's not scooting out of place now the way that it was able to before. I'm hopping back over to try and size the next piece. All right, so we now have a design that we can spot check again, see how we're fitting. So lost a little bit of my angle there. I can probably straighten it out and it'll do just fine. Oh, I still have a blob of solder in the corner. I'm gonna have to take that out if it doesn't flow. Next, soldering. Where's my corner start? So here is my first pair of walls with, again, a little overage from the beginning because I need room to file as needed. And now I need to find this point to mark and measure. And I need to be just outside of it because the bend is going to take some away from it. So the probable precision answer is, went to how wide is the thickness of the metal, is how far away from the tip of your stone you need. I'm eyeballing it to give myself a little bit of fold room, basically. Do keep in mind that this one is much harder to resize than the method one, where we could resize the pieces individually. As soon as you've got two different thicknesses, it's harder to stretch. And I'm scoring. And then I'm going to use the saw. And so we're doing a triangle first because think about this multiplied by now we have, when we get a fourth wall, it's going to be even harder to get in to get this measurement, which is why you'll see that for an emerald cut, we're going to lay the whole thing out and pray to the measurement gods that my measurements are doing well that day. Because it's about making sure you have enough room for all of your creases and then doing the folding. So again, I'm not trying to cut through, I'm just trying to deepen the score mark that I gave myself. And I'm going back in with my triangle file. I think Wednesdays are more dropsy days than others. Maybe Maybe Thursdays get a little more dropsy as I get towards the weekend and want my relaxation time in the studio. Again, I always want to speed up this filing, and I should not. Slow and steady. One of the other reasons I like method 1 over this method is that you can catch your mistakes with less time invested in the setting. Because let's say that my measurement is way off and it's super loose. I'm kind of screwed at this point because I've made my cornering and I can't squish it. Whereas if I had made the outer wall and it was too big, I could just trim it down, re-solder it, and get back to it. Again, our goal on this first pass is about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through, both the upper and the lower, or the outer and the inner walls. And hopefully now you can see why I pre-made my other step material so that I don't have to go through this whole anything but the direct sizing layer of it. Okay, take that first bend and see how we're looking. So once again, holding it up a little closer for you to see, I'm putting my pliers just to the outside of my cut mark, and I'm using my hands to push to the pliers. I'm not taking the pliers and trying to torque it. So not bad for a first pass. Didn't quite square up.
Bring it up.
Pardon?
Just say, bring it up a little bit. That was crucial.
Is that enough?
No, I meant up on your screen.
Oh, it was down too far. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So because I failed to use that final touch up with the square file, I didn't get a terribly deep bend. I'm going to go back in and try to cheat it halfway bent and use the triangle file to clean it up a little bit more. It's beyond the fold point at which the square file would do me much good. So again, pushing to the piece rather than using the pliers to torque it. And I can only go so far with that level of bend. Now I get my saw in there and start nibbling away, saw as file instead of as saw.
So did you say you used a square file?
On this last bend, I forgot to use the square file. So instead I opened it back up and used the triangle a little bit more deeply, because once you've made it past the 90-degree mark, the square file isn't going to do much good. Or rather, it's going to be too wide of a gap. So now I just did a touch up with the triangle file, and now I'm back to little bits at a time with the saw. What happens when I'm talking and filing at the same time. Okay, further with each saw, with each filing using the saw. And it gets harder and harder to position yourself. And this is, I'm working big for a reason on these so that you guys can see them, and because trying to work tiny is even harder to get your saw in the places that you want to trim down. We're getting close. One thing John doesn't cover in the variety of settings that he shows special handling for is a trillion cut, which is one of my favorite. I'm not a huge fan of triangles, but I love trillions. The difference there is you got to get a curvature in each of these places that you're adjusting. So you're not only worrying about the straight line, but you're also worrying about, does each bend come in the same amount? Or is the stone setting carefully on it? That one is a
Rachel,
set.
you're off. Oh,
There we go.
you-
Sorry.
yeah,
Just hold
you
it
were
too
off
close.
screen.
Thank you. Okay, so we're getting super duper close to the point that if I put my stone back in to position, get it the right way. Which stone direction is this supposed to be? I should be able to start seeing the stone being held a little bit. So I did not give myself quite enough room, and you have to be careful with the triangles because they've got a very pointy end to their facets. If I were to hold this in place too snugly, I might chip the ends of my stone. Before we set it, what we're going to do is take a ball burr and dig out a little space in each corner. So I can only get an approximation of that I'm on track to fit. And you can see that I've got a little bit more angle to go to get it flush up to what I need. But I'm very, very close. So I'm going to get a little more sawing in there. Remembering to put my burr life down. Okay, so we are now at the point where my walls can meet up. That is not the finished angle that I need. Starting spot, there's the starting spot. But it's very, very close. The reason it's not perfect, and let's see if I can, I'm going to bring this over to my good camera on the bench so that I can show you an example of what I'm talking about with that fitting and how we're going to have to get cornered. Bear with me while I zoom in a little bit. Hopefully get this so it's not too fuzzy for you guys. So what I'm talking about why this is a harder one to fit is this gap that comes right here when we meet up. Oh, I'm out of camera.
We can't see.
There we go.
That's okay.
This camera, this gap, it's literally the width of the difference between the inner wall and the outer wall. So I could trim away some of this. I could work and get the angles, but I'm never going to have these just straight up meet up when they're running across. So one of the choices would be to take a little notch out of that side that is the height of the inside wall, so that this outer piece, the upper notch, slots right in there, and we get a solder line. But there's no really great options. So what John is asking us to do on this is to get it to the point we want it size-wise, and then saw down.
Move it
I'm
over,
out
Rachel.
of frame again. Get it to the size we want, and then saw down at this angle to get that line to meet. And that's the tricky part.
So it's a miter cut.
Pardon? Yeah, it's a miter cut, but your miter cut, it's not a nice neat miter cut because we have to get a slightly different cut at the top half where there's only one level than we do down below. It's the same angle ultimately, but it's kind of catawampus to itself because it needs to be a smaller level of angle, a smaller saw point, and then we get to the wider saw point, and it's a little challenging. That's all I'm saying. So a combination of sawing and filing will hopefully get us there. And let me get to the right camera again. Any questions before I go into the scary sawing and filing part?
Where in the book is the scary filing part?
So he doesn't, that's the problem, and that's why I pointed out it back on page 67.
68?
67. When talking about the square one, he talks a little bit about it in the image detail. Let me give you my face instead of, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
on
I
that
see
right-hand
the
side.
last one.
Yeah, and but the problem is he's not articulating how to do this magical thing particularly. He also talks a little bit about, so that the drawings on page 69 about the triangle, that method only does the trick if you're working with method 1, where you have 2 separate things. In order to get what on page 68, he's showing what happens if you do the careful sawing and filing. And he talks about how you're mitering it. In an angled stone, it's often necessary to bend further. After making the initial one, insert a saw blade and cut 3/4 of the way through. Oh, that's the prep for the other angles. So his drawing on the upper right-hand side of page 68 shows the final side of the triangle closure magically mitered.
Oh, okay, yes,
But
I
he-
see
But
that.
he doesn't actually give us specifics on it, which is what makes me think that John himself may not do this style very often. He may prefer to do the 2-parter.
Oh, okay. Okay, got it. All right.
Yeah. So that's a little bit challenging in this set of things. But by the time we get to emerald cut, it's critical to have the 2-parter. It's much, much harder to fit an emerald cut 2-piece together than it is to do method 2, where it's all built together. It's just, we're still counting on getting that final closure angle very carefully done.
I have total faith in you, Rachel. You
The emerald cut is my nemesis. Say that again.
I have total faith in you, Rachel. I know
That
you
is
will be able
correct.
to get it there for us. You'll teach us. I have faith.
I will try. The emerald cut is my personal nemesis. Although,
Rachel?
Yep.
Wait, is there a photo, a drawing that talks about that notch you were trying to cut out?
No, he doesn't get into it. So
Yeah. Okay.
what I've been doing is, like, I've been practicing this week with different variations on how to approach the 2-parter, because I know there are good reasons to use it. Like I'm fairly convinced that it's easier to do the teardrop with this pre-made shelf. But I'm not sold yet on using it for triangles, and certainly not as much for ovals and so on. Although the benefit of the ovals and rounds is once you're done, you're done. Like, there's no cornering, so maybe it's easier on those. I find I get more precision out of the 2-part method than out of the make a wall first method. So I'm trying to, this is part of my process in going through John's book, is to try and engage in the variations that he's provided to see what we can learn about things. Okay, back to the what I've been avoiding, which is the actual doing that final corner. And I gotta find my starting point so that I make sure my measurements are good. Uh-oh, did I erase my point? Oh no, I wiped off my dot. Okay, gotta figure this out. I think that's what I go to. That. Okay. So I think I have left myself just enough room that if I start filing this angle, which means I have to get this out of the way a little bit. I'm not putting my solder in there until I have this angle all prepped. I'm going to create an angle on the inside, the first edge that I started, to give myself a starting point for meeting. This is going to be challenging. A little more. Had I thought ahead, I might have marked this and put in the angle before I started my second bend. Probably should have pickled this too. Yeah, I've got too much crud on here right now. Let me pickle this for a few minutes and see if anybody has questions while I am letting that clean up.
Well, as you were talking about that miter and doing that 45-degree angle before you did that second bend, maybe you could put it in that miter jig that already has the 45-degree angle and do that at the very beginning.
So the challenge is on a triangle, it's not going to end up being a 45.
Okay.
But you're right that you could start it that way. What it means is you're giving yourself no excess. If you're committing to that being your end, you're
Right.
committing to that being your end.
Yeah.
This is the back and forth about what's going to work best for you. Let's see. When marking where the second bend goes, is it the thickness of the inner bezel away from the corner of the stone? It should be the thickness of the combined bottom piece, because if you think about it, what we're doing is we are going to the point at the end of the stone plus a fold worth of metal. Let me draw this one because my hands at the angle they come up to the camera are not doing much good. Drawing. So we have our lovely stone, and we have made this bend successfully and have a bunch of metal sticking out this way, right? And so we've soldered that, and we're needing to find this point, but then we're going to be bending it approximately the thickness of this total upper lower metal. So the total
You
width.
froze.
Oh, did I catch up? Still frozen?
It looks fine to me.
Can you see my face now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
maybe local. Okay, so we draw that again for those that missed it in the freeze. We've got our extension. Our stone ends right here, but we're about to take a notch out of it that is then going to fold over onto it. We can't cut all the way through, obviously, but what we're doing is we're collapsing the combined thickness of the two, so this becomes that, right? And so if I have it too close, if I have it right up against the end of the stone, you see how it's starting to push into that corner. But if I give myself a gap before I start of the width of the metal, then what's happening when I push it in is it's closing to the point that these meet at. So this is a really piss poor drawing, I apologize. But we're gradually closing and angling it more and more with each saw that we do, the little saw filings that we've been doing. So you're giving yourself enough leeway to have the collapse on itself, which is the thicker of our two thicknesses, because we have the thing that's going to get in the way is the combined thickness of the outer and inner walls, because it's collapsing in on itself, or it's bending in on itself. Did that help, Natasha? I hope.
Thank you. Yep.
And again, there are certainly ways out there to do this with math if you're more math oriented than I am, and much more precision measurements and so on. For me, I'm doing a lot more eyeballing than not on those. Let me see if that is clean. Any other questions? Okay, good to clean from the pickle. I feel a little bit happier about putting my files on it. Okay, back to getting that angle in there.
I just think
So-
this is very hard to do. I mean, when I tried to do it, when I folded it, it broke. Like I went too deep.
Yep.
and-
So you saw how many back and forth things I did where I was doing a few soft saw marks on it and then folding and sawing and folding and sawing, folding.
yeah.
The sawing, after you've made your initial file and started your first bend, that sawing is literally only cutting through the material that you've squished over the gap you made before. It shouldn't be filing down in further into the gap. And so it's super easy to overdo. But
Yeah.
slow
I
and
was
steady
getting a
wins the race.
circle. I'm sorry.
Say
Go
again?
ahead. I was getting a circle when I was trying to turn it. Like
We're getting a
shows another-
circle.
like a round edge and not a flat edge.
Oh, when you were trying to bend the corner,
Yeah.
then that means that your first filing was not deep enough.
Mhm.
So you need to go closer to the 2/3 of the way through in order to get the crisp corner, and make sure you use those parallel jaw pliers. Super, super helpful for that crispness.
Yeah, I bought those. I'm happy with those.
Yeah, they're kind of magical.
Yes.
How far along did I jam up? Did you see me fixing up my bend? Filing?
You had just finished the file and you were holding that up
So-
to the camera.
Okay, good. So not much missed. Excellent. Let me see, position it again. Side, that side. If you can, make your first triangle an actual equilateral triangle. Your life will be much simpler. So I'm thinking that I'm going to take the length of I'm going to measure my side of my triangle that I have not yet cut for, and actually use tools for an amazing change of pace instead of eyeballing. That's in the right side. That in the right side. There we go. So I'm getting the length that's left, and I'm going to mark it. Seems wide. Figure out if I've got this the wrong way. There we go.
You're off camera again.
Thank you for that. Sorry, all I'm doing is marking where I'm gonna cut my excess. And then I'm gonna trim the extra length back. Right, so I'm gonna start an angle on this piece and finish it with that sawing. It'd be good to myself and actually saw this piece instead of snipping it. Okay. We're doing for fitting. Part of the challenge is that I keep managing to warp my walls as I work the other walls. And I want them as straight as possible.
Plus it has to be hard to squish it.
Yeah. But because I'm folding things in and out of the way, and because it's different thicknesses at different places, it ends up moving around on me a little bit. And I keep missing my first position. It's definitely the first position. Okay, so what I've got is metal that I'm going to anneal because this is too springy for me to hold in position to saw. So let me go quickly anneal things. I always like to remember to put it bottom side up because it's easy to overheat the thinner of the walls and not really manage to get the other wall. French, and hopefully didn't need pickling because I didn't flux it again. Okay, there we go. That's a little happier to squish together the way I want it. We're actually in a pretty good position right where we are because we've got good angle on that first one. So I'm now, this is the part that John doesn't go into a lot of detail about. I'm going to just try to hold it together. And I'm going to cut down. I think I may want to move to a finer saw blade just to give myself a little more control, even though it'll be slower to cut.
Was this a 4?
This was a 2, I think, that I was working with because I was actually cutting some 18 gauge for the Pear part of it, so I'm going to try heavier gauge on that one. So I'm going to drop down to 2/0, which is going to be slow going on the bottom half of this, but will at least give me a little grip on the thinner sheet. Oh goodness, it's not at all tight. Okay, so the magic of television, boom, we're going to get cut through both of these. Well, we got something. What a terrible cut that was. That
You're
angle
frozen.
also got really warped cut.
You're frozen.
Oh no, hang on. Can you see my face again?
You weren't frozen on my side.
Okay.
Yeah, you were on mine. Now I can see your face, yes.
Okay. Back to the terrible cut I just made, which definitely needs a little touch-up cutting. So let me get myself a squaring line and do that properly because I've got a lot of overage.
Could you do that squaring line in camera so I can see? Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Okay.
I've got to
Oh.
get all of that off of there. So let's see if I can take this little bit off without changing my angling too much, because otherwise it looks like a pretty good cut. to work to do the connection that we want.
Be careful with the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm barely actually touching the other side. Wow, this is an awkward position to cut in. No, it's closer. Getting there. I'm not a fan. I gotta say, I'm not a fan of this approach.
Couldn't you have just overlapped it and soldered it and then cut it?
No, because that gap that I was describing, when you overlap them, you have a hole between the V. That's that's why I'm not a fan of this one for cornering. It just makes it that much more challenging. I'm gonna try going from the other side to really get your
Angle.
angle. Yeah. See if I can do this without cutting myself today.
Rachel, I must say that I just tried a new product that it was amazing. It's that Pepe butter lube, sawing lube butter. And I thought I was really against it. And then they handed it out free and I tried it. It's really good stuff.
Nice. Good to know. Yeah, I've heard a lot of things about it. I just haven't had a Pepe order in a while. So
Yeah.
I haven't ordered just for the sake of that.
It just made things really smooth. There was no jerkiness and stuff.
Nice.
It's messy though.
This is, oh, the butter is, yeah. This is messy too.
I also bought it. I like it. You
Can't
can
hear you.
use it
Just
for the butter. It's called
say
butter.
again?
It's called butter for the blade.
Yeah, it's butter blade butter, something like that.
Yeah.
Blade butter, yeah.
You don't need that much. I just put it on my finger and then I put it on the blade. It's also great for like when you're doing disc, when you're cutting disc to smooth the disc cutter ends.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was putting it on the metal too.
Okay, this is getting worse and worse every time I attempt it. Wow, that's an atrocity.
Oh no.
Let's see how it's fitting though. See if I have the leeway. I think I do. Well, maybe I do. So if I can file this cleaner, then I might be able to salvage it. And if anybody has successfully navigated this kind of corner filing and has tips for us, there probably are some industry secrets out there that I'm unaware of for cleaning up this kind of a cut.
What about like the small disc you attach to a Fordham? It's a sander.
To sand it, you could, yeah, absolutely, and you might be able to get a cleaner angle, like a more controlled angle.
Yeah,
Do you mean a sanding disc or a separating disc?
So either could have its purposes in this. I think a sanding disc is more likely to be controlled. I think a cutting disc is likely to rip at the difference in the metal. But that does have a heavy duty sanding disc to get this angle cleaned up might actually be nice and useful. Because this is painful, guys.
Well, at least we know what it's like. I mean, you know, you watch some videos and then they cut out all the stuff in the middle and magically they come to the point where the two edges are together and you're like, what? How did they get there?
So what I'm trying for my filing here is to use the lovely barrette blades, my barrette file, to get between the two at the angle that I'm trying to aim for, so that I can clean up both sides separately, but bringing them closer and closer together. And it's getting some of what I need.
So if you were to do it again, you said you would do one side when you start?
I think I would, because it gives you a head start on keeping things square. The downside of that is that you have to be really, really precise in getting that first wall measured and leaving yourself enough that, you know, you have to be able to leave enough that you got the angle and you've got the room for the fold further down. So the short of it is this technique requires a lot of precision measuring, whereas the two-part technique allows a little bit more maneuver as you go.
What if you use the smaller file?
I like the large file because if I use a small file, I tend to torque a little bit. This gives me a nice straight wall to work against. So it's not that I'm taking too much away. The idea is use the largest file you can control in whatever you're doing, so that it's you're doing the least amount of work for the most return. We're getting there. It's kind of ugly, but we're getting there.
Looking good.
There's still an awful lot of material in the way on this side in particular. I think what the next time I email John, I may have to ask him, do you really use this approach? Or what are we missing?
I would email him tomorrow.
I try not to bother him too much. John does a lot of, he cares for a number of cats. And by number, I mean, at one point he had 37 that he and his wife were taking care of. There's a colony of feral cats that he sort of adopted in his neck of the woods. And so we occasionally exchange cute kitty pictures and things like that. But I worry about what those kitties will do in the future.
Has he stopped working?
John, yeah, John, so the whole reason that I kicked off this project is that John finally retired from teaching after 30-something years. And I used to take at least one of his classes a year. And so what I wanted to do was continue learning, even though I can't do it directly from him. And I realized I had not really worked through every activity that he describes in the book, nor did I have the first few times that I read the book when I first got it. I didn't have the appreciation of some of the nuance of what he was writing about. And after having gotten the book, I among other things, I got to take his stone setting class, which opened my eyes a lot to some of it. But I realized that I learned a lot of the little bits and pieces, not from his stone setting class, but from other classes I took with him. And in reading through this as a textbook, instead of as a, hey, I'm going to flip to the section I want to do today, I'm finding a lot of little tiny things that are both part of my practice or should be part of my practice on a more regular basis. Okay, so we've now gotten it filed to the point that the sawing is really back to acting like a file. And I'm going to do a series of cut throughs that are just making it more and more in line with the angles that I'm aiming for.
It's really looking good.
Getting closer. I'm not sure it's going to fit my stone anymore.
It'll fit. It'll fit. It'll fit. Positive thinking. It'll fit.
Yeah, you can make it bigger.
It's tough to stretch when it's the double wall like this, but it's marginally doable.
But now, didn't you say you were going to take a burr to the corners?
I am that's for the very points on any faceted
Okay.
stone that has sharp points. You want to give it a little pocket so
Okay.
that it doesn't put pressure on the most fragile points of the stone when you're setting.
Well,
gives-
maybe we'll have to give this one a little bit of bigger pocket.
Yes. Okay, where are we in this? So we're very, very close. It's got a little bit more torque than I want. So let me see what I'm doing. What's causing that? So I could cheat and I could solder this as is, and I could fill that corner with solder, but that's not entirely the way I should be going when I'm trying to slow my practice. I'm going to do a couple more passes with the saw. Again, sometimes just, oh, that did the trick. Sometimes just flipping it so that you're not working at the same direction all the time is going to do the trick. Let me straighten this out a little bit. And you have two choices. You either get it to be a nice, clean, sticks together on its own fit. Looking okay for soldering. There's a little bit of edge because of all the filing I've done. Or you use binding wire if it's trying to spring back on you in order to hold it in place. And binding wire can be your friend, but it can also be a pretty big enemy if you don't use it terribly carefully. It can really distort your piece. When you use binding wire, make sure it is never heavier gauge than the material you've got bound by it, because the steel will contract and collapse whatever you're working on. So as a reminder, I never went back and soldered the corner that was the second bend. So in this stretch, I'm going to both solder that corner and the seam corner. I need to put a little bit there. Whoop. There we go. And once again, I'm working from the back first. Failed to flux. John double fluxes everything, not one spray and one paste, but he actually fluxes, heats, refluxes with his paste flux. The first one is sort of a cleaning activity, and as it burns off, the oils and stuff will burn off too. And the second one, make sure that it's well coated. I know it's what he does, and I keep forgetting to do it myself. It's something I got to try and add back in. And there's that corner, the one that was just a fold. solder. So all my hard solder bits have fallen. And all I'm doing is stabilizing that corner that I filed and sawed the crease into. And it doesn't try to leap off the edge. And again, we're trying to use hard solder throughout this exercise. Little guy, solder where you're supposed to. All right. Wow. A little hotter than I wanted to go.
Woo, woo.
Yeah, well, it's kind of triangular. We're going to toss that in the pickle for a few. That had some heavy activity on it. And any questions in the meantime? Okay, no questions? Oh, I don't have my chat up. That's why I can't see if there are questions. All right, so that is the triangle. I'm going to say, let's do the pear and do the square after that, because I think probably I'll have time to do a pear today. I always want to leave that 15 minutes for anybody to show what they've been working on. And so while that one is pickling, and then we'll find out whether it was sized well enough or not, we will do we'll do the prep on the pear. So thankfully I pre-made the wire, I mean the bezel for this, so you don't have to go through all of that pain. And instead of 3 points, we only have 1 point on this one. So let me switch over and look at this lovely
Rachel, that was just amazing. That was just so wonderful.
Well, it was a stressor for me, I got to tell you, because I'm not a fan. I'm really not a fan of that two-parter. I mean, of the all-in-one for that shape. I would absolutely be doing my triangles in 2 parts on a regular basis, but I'm trying to get better. And I still feel like there's something I'm missing about why he encourages that as a method. I don't know whether he's just teaching it for the sake of it's a way to do it versus, you know, it's something that he would actively tell us to do. But I got to try. So thank you for following along as I make a sloppy triangle. Okay, so the pear is on, what page does he have pear information on? I want to say it's on page 70. Yeah, so page 70. And for this one, I opted to do an 18 gauge outer wall. And I still go with the 14 gauge inner wall. Excuse me, not the 14, the 24 gauge. Again, it's just me playing around with, it's a big, nice chunky stone. I'd like to maybe do some cutaway once I make this one. He has some really lovely pictures in there of different ways that you can take away material and still leave it a strong setting. So for this, we are starting with something that follows the similar curve of the pear-shaped stone that you're putting it in. I've got a pear bezel. It's kind of close to that. It'll get us started. So I might as well start my curvature around it. It's set. I think I need to anneal. I didn't think I'd hardened this much in the process. Give me a second. And since we probably aren't going to get to the square this time, I have a square cab that I was going to do. I may prep for both a square cab and a square faceted stone because they have different challenges. But next week, next session rather, not next week, 2 weeks from now, is going to be the marquee. And I believe we're going to get started, if not hopefully finishing, an emerald cut. Let me see, is that what I planned? Yeah, so assuming I finish the pear setting today, next time will be square and marquee, and possibly starting, excuse me, square and marquee, and possibly starting the emerald setting. For the marquee, somebody asked me on the Facebook group specifically if I could do a faceted one. So I'm going to use a faceted stone, but you can also, again, any of these can be done with either. Or both, you know, do one of each, get extra practice in. Oops, wrong bench. There we go, that's the bench we want. That gives me a little bit more bend. So if I need to, I'm going to take some half round pliers and start this bend with them. It's because I've gotten, you know, because I'm doing this with the 18 gauge outer, this is going to be a little bit more difficult to bend with my hands. I do want to make sure that I'm bending equally from top and bottom so that it doesn't curve in at all, you know, it doesn't taper in at all. And on curves, you can always semi-cheat and use your ring bender if you've got a, like I have a Pepe, I think it is. So I'm just trying to get my first curve, and I need the material to cut beyond the end of the stone on that side. So I've given myself a little room for that. Grab my parallel pliers because I'm doing way too much tapering on this. Get myself some.
So is that a citron? Is that the
Pardon?
stone? A stone, what kind is it? Is it?
It is a lemon quartz, I believe, if my notes that I took at the time of purchase are correct. Pretty color.
Yeah.
Hard to find. I would not be using a citrine of that size as my test stone, because those are much pricier. I think I got myself a pair of half round pliers. I mean, half rounds. No, I didn't. Those are not half rounds. Okay, I was hoping I had bought myself a pair of half round parallel jaw, but I guess I did not. So I'm gonna try to get this a little bit more consistent on the mandrel. Put it the right direction, that's helpful. And I'll work with just the mallet.
How can you tell if something is glass or if something's a gem?
I am not a gemologist and have never taken any courses in it. So I am not the one to answer that question, but if anybody else has done a GIA program or anything and can give us quick tips for that, pop on. Anybody have any quick, how do you tell if it's glass versus something else?
Well, I know glass, you can see kind of the letter C in it. It's called a conchoidal shape. And quartz does not have that. So you're looking for those conchoidal C's in glass.
Conchoidal C's, as in the like a shape of a C?
Yeah, conchoidal.
Uncoidal. It's not a term I know. Has anybody gone? Sorry, go ahead.
Gemology for Schmucks is on YouTube, and he does a good job of answering that question. So,
Awesome.
yeah.
Can you post that concept up to the list, and we'll put a link up in the Facebook group?
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so my curve is a little bit less curved than that. Let's see what have I got that I can work this against. Yeah, I used to be able to manipulate 18 gauge sheet with my hands. This is the aging process.
That's heavy. But fabulous when it's done.
I hope so. I really like the idea of a more consequential bezel.
Yeah.
So we're getting close to that curvature, but the bottom end is not doing quite what I want. And I'm of the opinion that one of the reasons chapter 3 has so many more variations than any of the other chapters is that it's really sort of foundational concepts to all the other settings that we do, both in terms of moving the metal, shaping the metal, and in terms of thinking about what it means to hold the stone.
Now, do you need to remember to do the edge before you do that, or no?
So you mean the filing of the edge or the
Yeah,
filing
like
of the end?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the end, this is the one that he shows crossing over.
Okay.
And then because it has a different angle than those squares and rectangles, do I think it probably would behoove us to put a little bit of an angle on there? Yeah, absolutely. But ultimately, his pictures are showing us cutting down the overlap basically, and then continuing to cut it till it's clean there. I'm with you that I think an angle on this edge, on this corner rather, would help us in the long run, but I've got to get my length right in order to do that.
Okay.
And I'm not quite there yet. I have to anneal this a couple times in order to get it where I want it. Again, don't forget that you are sizing from the back basically, because you need it to be snug when it's sitting on the wall. It's pretty close. I'm going to then bend from there. So.
So I was thinking about getting some of those small mandrel that you use
Yep.
at Auto Fry. Is there anything else? Because I've been sort of holding off to see. I've
At
gotten,
Auto Fry that you would buy?
yeah, because I've already gotten the gravers and everything else you had suggested.
But
But
I mean, not knowing what tools you already have. Like if you said I have $1,000 to spend, what should I buy next? I'd have lots of ideas for you. But in terms of the stone setting, as long as you like for the prong setting for chapter 4, the big thing is having multiple pairs of the cross-locking tweezers in steel, not titanium, that you can modify.
I have those. I got the files. I made the prong setters or the bezel pushers.
Yep.
I got the 10 plus to see.
So I'm going to saw the angle to start on this, and then I'll file it and then finish my shaping, because this is so heavy. I'm having challenges with it. What do I need? I need my square. Buried somewhere. Where did I bury my square? So many tools. So little time. My secondary square. Gotta break a blade sometime. That's what happens when I stick with the 2/0 blade on an 18 gauge piece of metal. Back to the number 2 blade. That's what I should have done. So what I'm trying with this cut to do is start my angle now that I know what my curvature is roughly going to look like. So I don't know if that's going to show up on camera, but hopefully you can see that there's a little bit of an angle started on that wall.
You're frozen.
It's perfect. You're frozen. We can see the angle.
Is my face back?
Nope.
Ah,
Yep.
Oh, it is.
there we go. Okay, caught back up. All right, so yeah, so there's a little bit of an angle there that I managed to cut. Remember that this is my top, so I got to be careful of that when I'm positioning things. I'm going to clean this up a little bit with the file, with the barrette file, to keep that angle going, but it's still not going to be my final little bit. I'm going to still saw between the two pieces. So what we're now at is, that's actually right at the end of where my stone will be. So that's a pretty good stopping point if I can get the rest of my curvature in. I'm going to re-anneal because I've been working it just to give myself that 18 gauge bend that I need. So I hope that this kind of skipping steps in that I prepped the bezel wall is okay with you guys. I figured with only 3 hours a session, you didn't
Yeah.
want to sit here and watch me make the same thing over and over again.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Shucks, Jamal, oh, just shucks or smucks? Schmucks is it? The gemologist for schmucks.
Schmuck. I don't want you.
If anybody happens to be able to search that and pop the link in, that'd be great. Okay, let's get this really rounded here. Really rounded and then really flat. Ugh, it's definitely not the right shape now. Hey gang, don't make your first one of these out of 18 gauge. That's my lesson for today. More control over it with a smaller palette. Rounding on the outer side, and we should be in good shape. Oof. This is a lot of metal to move by hand. Did it? Size it back up a little bit.
I tried looking at for gemologists for shucks on YouTube, but it didn't pop up.
I think it's SCHMUCK.
SCHMUCK. Okay, I'll look again.
Okay. Or gemology or gemologist. I'm not sure if it's gonna.
I dropped the link in the chat too.
Oh, you did. Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Jen found it.
Great.
All right. Yeah. So a lot of creating a setting is this tweaking of the size and the fit. It can take far longer than any of the soldering and filing components of it. So don't be frustrated by it. Do give yourself the patience, the permission to take your time at it, because your end results, if you slow down and do it right out of the gate, are going to be so much nicer and so much less frustrating in the long run. All right, so we got a good curvature until we hit that wall. That's pretty good. And once again, we could probably use some math in here to measure our exact inner wall of the, the outer dimension of the stone and mark it up against the inner wall and measure it out. But then got to be careful that you've accounted for all the angles and all the cutting away that you're going to do. So I'm going to trim off a bunch of my excess because I'm now getting close enough that I can tell I need far less than I have. That saw blade. So if you're like me and you were taught always saw absolutely straight up and down, that is the only way to saw. It may have been a bit of an eye opener to suddenly find that there are situations where that doesn't work as well. Cutting through really heavy gauge metal is one of them, where you want to alternate a little bit between sort of angling a little bit forward and then sawing a little ways in and then straightening out until you can't go straight up and down anymore, and then angling a little bit forward to grab. So it's not always that we're using our jeweler's saw in full upright position. It's just as often as you can, because you'll get straighter lines. Oops, put burr on there. You'll get straighter lines by working upright most of the time. But it doesn't work in all situations. So that one, if you saw me tipping forward every once in a while, it's because I've got the 18 gauge plus the 24 gauge layered on top of it. So it's a fairly heavy material that needed a little bit more bullying with the saw than I was getting out of a straight saw. Okay, let's see. Is this going to get me the angle I am looking for? There. Over, always work from both sides. On time. Okay. So my second edge or second end is going to pass by the first edge. I've matched this correctly. Then I'm going to cut through them as a pair, no pun intended. I know that my size is working. I still definitely need a little more curvature at the bottom. I'm going to actually put this on a round mandrel because the Pear is not quite steep enough of a curve. So I'm just grabbing a good old ring mandrel to get the base shape a little bit more robust. Fits the curve at the bottom much better. Okay, so both the edges need to come in a little bit. Right, I think we're there. Just need them matching up. So this is where we're headed. Once we get that closed, that'll use up that little bit of gap that I have. There we go. There's a smidge of a gap down at the bottom, but by the time I've closed it, can't both hold this and show it very well, but getting to the right size, I just need to get these two components together. And then we've got to do the saw through thing again. So given that it still wants to spring, I gotta anneal it one more time. Any questions as we go? Can you use a non-tapered round mandrel? Absolutely. John's known for saying anything that you can wrap your metal around is a mandrel. And at one class he said, except your sewer lines. I can't remember the context of whether he had tried it and used the wrong thing to hammer on, or he was just assuming. But yeah, if you have a straight up non-tapered, absolutely go for it. If you don't have any oval mandrels, put 2 round mandrels back to back, or 2 wood dowels, even better, and it makes an oval. Whatever you can use to get the shape you need. That was the annealing it needed. We're doing a little too big still. So I'm going to curve that back end a bit. Another great thing to pick up for mandrels is in an auto shop, auto repair equipment. Can't remember the name of the rods. They come with a little dimple on one end. Anybody know the name of the tools that I'm talking about? They're straight rods. They have a little tiny pointy dimple at the end.
Paper punch.
Paper punch?
Yep.
Huh. Okay. I hadn't thought of that one. I don't think that's the part I was thinking of. But,
Rachel,
yeah.
can you change your camera?
Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. I thought I had. Didn't hit twice, I guess. Yeah, they're specifically for adjusting something in the end.
Sorry, I meant transfer punch.
Oh, transfer rod, yes.
Yeah.
Transfer rod. That's the right thing. And you can modify them, don't be afraid to modify tools. Those transfer rods are way cheaper than any bezels that are on the jewelry market. So take one and grind it down as needed. We're looking. All I'm trying now is to get my overlap. That's what we're talking about. Okay, so I've now got a snug fit. And I'm going to take my heavy gauge saw blade, which is very poorly put in the saw. Tighten that up a little bit. Take the blade, and once again, we're going to attempt the cut through both at once. However, we did do that slight bit of filing on the inner one. So it should be a little bit cleaner of a cut.
Hey, Rachel, before you start,
Sure.
why don't you put the blade on the inside and saw outwards?
I can try that.
And I would probably use a thinner blade, more like a 4-0, 3-0.
Okay, you go with even with an 18 gauge plus 24 gauge on top of it.
Which blade do you have in there now?
I was using a 3, a fairly coarse blade because of how thick the material is.
No, I would maybe a 2-0.
Yeah, 2.0 is my general go-to for anything basic. Is that Alan telling me that, or somebody else popping on?
That was that about the blade?
Yeah,
That was me, Alan.
I didn't know if we had other male voices on, and I haven't got your voice down yet. So yeah, we can try this cutting from the inside out. What'll be interesting is that means that we're catching against the wall at two different points because we've got the lower wall and I'm gonna actually thread it on there first though. So it's a little bit of catching the thicker wall and then the thinner wall. I think actually, now that I'm saying that, I'm going to want to do from the top down if I'm going this way, so that I start with my heavy gauge material and then cut through to thinner, because that transition. So the transition from a heavy gauge to a thinner gauge.
Also, do it diagonally, slightly diagonally, not flush up against the seam. No,
Diagonally. Slightly diagonally so that I don't have a straight line when I'm done.
hit the top first and then the bottom.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So angled, not straight up and down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
what
yeah.
I was just talking about going through heavier gauge metal. Yes.
Same.
Yep. Oh, yeah, you get a much better view of the material that you're cutting when you do it this direction. Thank you. Great tip. Fantastic. I love it. That is a much straighter line than the poor little triangle I was working on.
You want another tip?
Sure.
Use the whole length of the saw blade with less pressure. Let the saw blade glide. Yeah, light like that. And the whole length of it.
All right. Much cleaner first pass. Thank you. All right, let's see. So I need to just line those back up again. Yeah, that certainly made it cleaner on the first pass. Probably need to do a second run. Think I would want my second run to be from the front now, simply because it's the edge that I need to clean up more. Beautiful. Let's see how that's fitting. Oh, this is going to be a little loose. I definitely need to take a little more material away. Fabulous. Got to get John to write that in the next edition of the book. No, I'm going to go from the inside again. I like that. Harder to get that tip. Not closed enough for that.
You could use a piece of tape to hold it together and saw
Yeah,
through.
my challenge usually, Alan, is that I don't always see my line. So if I'm taping it, I'm not sure I'd be getting a straight cut. Little saw blade in there. I think I need to buy myself a new frame. This one may have outlived its usefulness. Right. I'm liking how much faster that was. Okay, let's pop over and solder this baby. And then we will chat about what everybody else has to show briefly. I'm sorry we ran a little bit long. Oops, I gotta cut myself some more hard solder first. Those of you that are on the East Coast have access to this particular type of fire brick. When I went to find, I got John, the type that John likes. I asked him about the manufacturer, and it turns out they're based out of like Philadelphia or something. And the only way that you can get them over to the West Coast is to order a pallet at a time. And I don't need a pallet of bricks. This is not closed enough for me to do that. Hang on. As a reminder, whenever you're closing a seam, if you keep silver from the back, it'll start to squeeze itself closed a little bit more, as opposed to heating it from right at the seam at first. It's maybe still too wide of a gap. Let's see. Yeah, that's definitely too wide of a gap. Sorry, guys. I've got to do one more round of adjusting. Despite the nice clean cut, what I was seeing was that I was a little too far apart, opening instead of closing. Yeah, there's definitely room for that to get squished down. Back to the soldering board. Back end opened up a little bit more. Front end. Needs that to get together a little bit more. There we go. Boom, boom. I love that chicken one. Thank you. All right, we have a pear-shaped one. So my vote is definitely for the pear shapes that the double wall, the build the wall in advance seems easier to me. I would have to do a few more gazillion of them to be positive. But getting that final point to match when you're doing a two-parter, I find a little bit more challenging than that, which is a much cleaner finished piece. Again, your mileage may vary, so play with them. Anybody have questions or anything about any of those? Next week, square and marquee. And if we're lucky, we'll start talking about emerald.
Great. You're doing a great job. Thank you very much.
Sure. Anybody have anything they want to show off or process shots?
No, but I'm sure the next time we all meet up, we're going to look a little bit more haggard after we've tried these two out today.
If you haven't done one of these, start with an oval. That to my mind is the easiest to feel like you've accomplished something. And go from there. Carmen, did you have something you wanted to show?
Yeah, I've been sort of working on this the whole time you've been talking because I
Okay.
needed to solder. I needed to, I think, file it down. So I was just, I don't know if you can tell or not, but
Let's
I
see.
sort of,
Wow. Look at you go.
but I'm
Gorgeous.
not sure. I'm not sure if I filed it enough.
Can
Like
you
I was
get
asking.
can you get more than a fingernail in between the edge of the stone and the wall? It looks like it might be a little high still to me.
Fingernail?
Yeah, about a fingernail's worth of height. Like your thumbnail is usually a pretty thick thumbnail. If you can get more than a thumbnail, or if you take a thin Sharpie, and you angle it right up against the edge of the stone and run it all the way around the inside. So literally like it's resting on the facets on the edge. If you run it around the inside of the stone, of the metal on the stone, so you're going to the opposite side. If I were my stone, I would be resting across the stone and drawing on the metal to the other side of it. So all I'm doing is marking a line at the top of the wall. Let me see if I can find a setting that I can do this in. So if this is my setting, right?
You need to spotlight. I can't see
Oh,
you.
sorry. Yep. So if this is my setting, right, I've got a stone in there. I'm resting my pen on the edge of the stone and marking the wall behind it all the way around. But I want it at sort of this kind of an angle.
Okay.
So not like this,
Mm-hmm.
but just resting along the bezel. I mean, along the facets. And if you draw that line, even steeper angle than that, even steeper angle. No, the other direction. Yeah, that shallower angle. Sorry, I should have said shallower. And you sketch it all the way around. That line, the thickness of these thin Sharpie markers is enough to hold your stone in. So take away down to that line, not below the line, but down to that line, and you'll be at a good height in most cases. There's a couple exceptions with, like, if you're doing, especially if you're doing a pear-shaped, sometimes you need to dip down a little bit more at the front. But that gives you a consistent thickness that you're aiming for all the way around, even if your stone is sort of lumpy and lopsided.
Okay.
That is looking gorgeous, though.
Oh, thank you.
Rachel, are you going to show us how to use the burr in the corner when we get to the square?
Yeah, so what I said at the outset is I think I'll probably do a round of actual setting of stones at the end of chapter 3. Because we've got variations. And so with that, I'll be using the handmade pusher, the stone, hammer set type thing. If you guys want, I'll pull out my micro motor, which is what I use when I'm hitting those 18 gauge bezels. because those are hard to get down by hand. We'll remind ourselves that we want to file the angles in, but not all the way in on any of the heavier gauge bezels. And then there's a couple of ones that are new to me at the end of the book. Like I've never done that funky cone, put it in adapt block thing that he does at the end of this chapter. So I want to do a whole bunch of setting at the end.
Oh, cool.
And
Cool.
we'll cover at the end of that chapter. Then we'll move on to chapter 4 and do the we have to go to the prong settings in the next chapter, which I'm looking for.
86.
Right.
Page
So,
86, I guess.
Say again.
86. Is that the
80?
page?
86 for which? For the funky cone setting?
Yes.
I think so. Let me see. That sounds about right. So we've got 2. We have the ones that start on page 80, which is setting cone shaped stones, where he's setting some from the back. And then after that, the very last one I think is the setting of the teardrop stone, which is why I keep referring to my Pear as a teardrop. I'm so excited to do teardrop settings. And then we move into chapter 4. So I would say that's probably 3 or 4 more sessions before we move out of chapter 3. Because one session alone will probably be setting.
I made some of those cones, you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to do a lot of lapidary when I first began. When I first began silversmithing, I couldn't find stones big enough because I like big jewelry.
Yeah.
So I went to a gem show, and there was a local lapidary club in Atlanta doing it. So I started taking the classes. Well, then when I went to class, everybody would want stones like mine. So
Yeah,
it ended up exploding.
And now they're hard to, like I had a hard time. I had to get some of my stones sent from overseas because I couldn't find anybody that had local cuts of the cones, the straight up cones.
And I like the long, slender cones too, where you make them where they're like about 1.5 inches long, because they make really kick butt earrings.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what other people are making out of these. And if you're making stuff in between, please post it up to the Facebook group. Give people inspiration.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other
I
show
just
and
love
tell?
this. I think this is fabulous.
Good. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Jen, you got something to show? Oops, you got to go off mute.
So I'm way behind. And I have some cool tourmalines that were kind of a bit of a curve on the back. So the 24 gauge round wire on the inside for the shoulder bezels worked pretty well. So I'm making these like little funky, let's see if I can mismatch strings. So they're kind of on purpose, not quite the same size. And there's this little curvy cutout at the top. So
Love it. I love the detail you're putting around the outside.
But
awesome.
Thanks. But the 24 gauge, I found round wire on the inside. It seems like a lot of tourmalines I buy just aren't quite perfectly flat. I mean, these are very nice tourmalines. And so that's just great for, giving just that little, edge all the way around so that the like butt of the back side of it rests against the backing. Even though I'm probably going to cut a lot of the backing out, I don't want the stone to, come down past the metal. So that was a good trick, which I've always resisted doing, and I made myself do it. So
you're doing both a ring and a back plate?
Yeah, so it's on the back plate, like if I was just doing a normal cab bezel, right, wall, and then inside the bezel wall, I just ran the 24 gauge round wire. Because you're right, if I cut out the back plate, the curve and finished the cutout kind of with the curve of the stone, it would sort of just sit in the back plate, which I've done in the past. But I don't want the stone quite poking its butt out in the back quite as much, especially because these are going to be post earrings. And so just adding that little whatever, fraction of a millimeter 24 gauges to like raise up just perfectly nestles that slight curve on the back of the cab really well. So
nice. Oh yeah, because it's what you've got is a not flat, but the edges lift up. Yeah, exactly. And it's just that gentle, like, I don't know if it's something about cutting tourmalines. I don't know anything about cutting stones, but I see it on tourmalines a lot for whatever reason, where I buy a cab, but like if you set it flat on a hard surface, it rocks just a teeny bit. Yep. Nice. Okay, anybody else?
I have
Okay,
another question.
oh, sorry, somebody else?
Yeah, I have another question.
Yeah,
I did 2 more. I did this one.
love the extra detail, nice.
Thank you. But I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be deeper. Because it's
So
a gap.
supposed to be is about what do you want out of the design? So first is function. Is it holding the stone? No rattle, no movement. Then it's deep enough. The second is what's the design factor? And sometimes design can override function, which you have to be careful of. Like, is it so tall that it's causing the ring to spin when they're wearing it? Like, is it off balancing it? But that's gorgeous. That looks nice and comfy. And if it holds the stone, you've achieved your base function and your height is about what you want it to look like design wise. It's great.
Well, with this one, it was the double, like what you showed us today with the soldering, the strip.
Yep.
And what ended up happening is the bottom kind of got messed up a little bit. So then I added the decorative to hide it.
Good fix. Good
Hey,
fix.
good idea.
Nice.
I'll have to remember that.
Yeah. And then this one was just simple. I was just trying to do just a simple cab.
And that one, unless there's an angle that I'm not seeing to your stone, that one's a little risky because I see the upper edge of the stone above the wall. So is that a completely straight wall or does it have a little bit of an angle on the cut of the stone?
No,
straight.
it's straight.
That one looks like it might be at risk of working its way out of it because none of your metal is coming over the top.
But the whole thing is solid. The stone is that deep.
Yeah, it's the movement that can happen over time that's the concern. You could get away with just making it tall only on the corners, for example, and just bend the corners over a little bit, or just as long as you have at least the sides of it hit in some way, or the corners so it'll hold it. That would all work. The other thing that you could do is try and get some glue in there, some epoxy. It's not ideal, but over time, because you know how soft silver is, it'll flex and move. And so over time it might loosen up. If it's for you, wear it and just keep an eye on it and check it every once in a while. But it's beautiful.
Everything is for me because I'm making samples.
Nice. All right. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's exciting to see these. So unless anybody else is out there with questions or things to show, I'm going to call it a night and remind you that if you would like to, not this weekend, but the next weekend is my clasps class, that's 3 clasps. And there's a few others up on my calendar. If you haven't already bought your John Cogswell book, but you're enjoying this, please support John by going out and buying a copy. Plus, it's an awesome, amazing book. And some of the things I'm rambling at you about will make more sense when you see his beautiful drawings. So enjoy, and I'll see you guys in 2 weeks, I think, and on 3/2, where we'll do square and shoulder bezels for marquee. And maybe we'll start to lay out the emerald because I'll probably try to get to the point where I can at least talk you through the measurement steps of emerald because it's a pain in the butt. But now we have that great tip from Alan about cutting. I'm gonna have to rethink which corners are easier to cut. So enjoy and happy jewelry making.
Thank you.
Thank you. See y'all in a few weeks.
Thank you so much.